Welcome to the Victor Emmanuel Nature Tours webinar. I am Ben Reynolds, producer and host of the webinar series. Today our presentation features a matchless experience with untold thousands of waterfowl and cranes, a wide diversity of raptors, and watching the dramatic courtship dances of the Greater Prairie-Chickens. Each spring, several million birds stop over along the Platte River in Nebraska on their northbound migration. Among them are more than 500,000 Sandhill Cranes, some 80% of the world population. This truly is one of the greatest of all North American wildlife spectacles. And today, we have veteran vet leader Rick Wright to take us on a virtual journey into one of the greatest migration spectacles in the world. Welcome, Rick, and thanks for presenting today.
Thanks, Ben. I'm looking forward to this.
And now we'll turn to Victor Emmanuel for his opening remarks.
One of my best, dearest friends, Peter Matheson, loved cranes so much that he just made a whole life of trying to see all the cranes of the world that he did. And he wrote a wonderful book called The Birds of Heaven about his experiences with the cranes. And particularly the people in Asia loved cranes, in Japan and China. And seeing them up in the air, they felt they came from heaven. And his book, The Birds of Heaven, is a wonderful book about the cranes. I just want to read you one short quote, and it comes from someone in China. "It's hard here on this earth, but if you meet a crane, your difficulties and misfortune will be eased. Therefore, every Yaku's child dreams of seeing a crane. Almost all our songs have to do with cranes, and our artists use precious mammoth ivory to sculpt over them." That's what a Chinese man wrote about cranes. And that's the way I feel about cranes too, that seeing cranes eases all of your problems in the world. So now, after sharing that from Peter Matheson's book, I want to turn the program back over to Rick to talk about the film.
Welcome, everybody, this afternoon. I'm glad to know that you're here, and I'm very eager to talk about one of my favorite subjects, cranes, and another of my favorite subjects, Nebraska in spring. Those of you who know me won't be surprised that we want to start in the past. We want to start about 10 million years ago, on a day that we know nothing else about, when a large, long-legged, long-necked gray bird slumped into a damp mix of clay and gravel and sand and died. That mud would become the Upper Snake Formation in what would become Nebraska, and the bird itself would be identified as the most ancient specimen known of the sandhill crane. We know nothing else at all about the circumstances of that ancient bird's life and death, but the very existence of that distantly prehistoric fragment of a wing bone demonstrates just how venerable the presence of the cranes is on what we now know as the Great Plains. Humans, of course, would not encounter this species before the lapse of an almost unimaginably vast stretch of time. Sandhill cranes, named red hares for reasons requiring no explanation, play a large part in the literary and mythological world of the Blackfeet and of other plains peoples, and historically, cranes played a somewhat larger part in their diets. White Europeans first met with this crane in Florida, in the wiregrass dunes of the Florida Sandhills, the origin of the bird's modern English name. Over time, though, the vastness of this species' true range was discovered. In addition to 3 sedentary populations in the Southeast and the Caribbean, Sandhill cranes breed from the Kamchatka and Western Siberia, across Alaska, Canada, and the northern tier of states, east now to Quebec and New Jersey. Large numbers also nest around the Great Lakes and in the Intermountain West. This extremely extensive northern breeding range, and the fact that all of these northerly nesting cranes migrate, might lead us to expect a great wave of sandhill cranes all across the continent each spring and fall, as birds move between their breeding areas and the winter range in Mexico and the southwestern United States. There's something to that in the autumn, when the cranes move south on a relatively broad front between the Rockies and the Mississippi River, and small numbers of sandhill cranes are regularly found east and west, sometimes far east and far west of that main route. In spring, though, it's different. In spring, it's very different. Every year, beginning at the end of January, the migratory sandhill cranes wintering in Texas and the Southwest grow restless, and warm late afternoons find flocks of hundreds of thousands spiraling upward on rising thermals to glide inexorably north. While the southbound migration was slow and diffuse, this northward movement in spring is tightly focused in time and in space. The first sandhill cranes reached the middle latitudes of their route to the breeding grounds in early February, and within a few weeks, all of them, the world's population, now approaching 650,000 birds, have gathered along a single small stretch of shallow river on the central Great Plains, where they will spend the month of March feeding, loafing, dancing, squabbling, courting, and roosting together before making the final push to the breeding grounds. For some birds, a push involving a flight of more than 4,000 miles. The cranes stop here in central Nebraska for one reason, and that reason is the Platte River, a priceless, if unprepossessing natural resource irresistible to that awe-inspiring mass of cranes, an almost inconceivable horde of other migratory birds, and tens of thousands of stupefied humans, birders and curious non-birders from all around the world, who arrive each spring with the birds to witness what I find the most moving natural history spectacle on the North American continent. The state of Nebraska is actually named for the Platte River. The Oto, a semi-nomadic Native American people historically resident in the area, called the river Nebraska, and that name was adopted by the Lakota when they migrated into the region themselves 250 years ago. The name means literally flat water, in reference to the broad, shallow channels of the river in its aboriginal state. French fur traders, using the river as a transportation artery and happy hunting ground, translated the native name straightforwardly as Rivière Platte. For the territory, though, and later for the state, the Oto label, Nebraska, was retained. This Platte River flows across the entire state of Nebraska. The river's two great branches, the North Platte and the South Platte, both arise high in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. The South Platte gathers snowmelt and flows south through Denver and across the high plains of eastern Colorado, then northeast across the sand sage prairies of southwest Nebraska to the area known as the Forks. The other tributary, the North Platte, flows north out of the Colorado Rockies into Wyoming, then east into Nebraska to merge with the South Platte. The resulting waterway, the Platte River proper, empties into the once wild Missouri below the steep clay and limestone bluffs at Plattsmouth, a downhill journey of 1,000 miles from where mountain snowmelt gives birth to the South and the North Platte. In an otherwise generally dry environment, the river and its waters have always been an indispensable resource to the area's human inhabitants. In addition to the Oto, the Missouri, the Iowa, the Arapaho, and the Pawnee spent part or all of their year on the banks of the Platte, establishing cultures and traditions that were still more or less intact in the 1820s and 1830s when the first white natural historians visited what is now Nebraska. This portrait of a Pawnee man is by the Swiss watercolorist Karl Bodmer, who, as the artist accompanying Prince Maximilian on his journey to the West in 1832, created an irreplaceable record of Great Plains life before smallpox, dispossession, and the extermination of the buffalo. By the time Lewis and Clark, Thomas Say, Thomas Nuttall, Prince Maximilian, and Audubon saw what would become Nebraska in the 19th century, the Plains Indians had actually known white visitors for well more than a century. The Platte River was the site of some of the earliest contacts between these native peoples and Europeans. Spanish armor is rumored to have been unearthed by the plows of later homesteaders, and hunters and beaver trappers were in frequent and frequently connubial contact with Native Americans. Not all of that contact, even in the earliest days, was peaceful. This painting on bison hide, produced in the 1720s, depicts a battle between Spanish soldiers on one side and Oto, Pawnee, and French forces on the other, an early precursor to the bloody proxy struggles conducted in North America by European nation states during their 7 Years' War. When white immigrants settled the American West in the 19th century, they too were dependent on this Platte River. As the only more or less flat route between the jumping off points on the lower Missouri and the Rocky Mountains, the Platte Valley was a natural highway, and the various emigrant trails west were among the nation's busiest thoroughfares beginning in the 1840s. More than 250,000 settlers moved along the Oregon Trail alone. And the river's significance as a transportation corridor continues to this very day. Interstate 80, which runs just shy of 3,000 miles from the George Washington Bridge to the Golden Gate, follows the wide, flat Platte Valley over nearly its entire length in Nebraska. Note on this map, too, that nearly all of the state's largest cities lie on the banks of the Platte River. We'll start our March tour, though, with birding visits to the two exceptions. Omaha is a few miles north of the Platte on the state's eastern edge. It was located there by land speculators in the days leading up to the opening of the Nebraska Territory in 1854. Omaha is now the largest city in the state by far, but its startling growth has left a number of the area's birding hotspots intact. A 90-second drive from our Omaha hotel is Carter Lake, a large, shallow oxbow created in 1877 when the wild Missouri River flooded and moved its course to the east. As a curiosity, the land inside the cutoff, the land that we're looking at across the water here, belongs to Iowa, such that generations of scrupulous state listers have spent a lot of time positioning themselves very carefully so that they can count a given rarity on their Iowa list or their Nebraska list, or ideally both at once. We won't really concern ourselves with that kind of thing. What brings us to Carter Lake is the nice diversity of waterfowl staging there, with possibilities ranging from trumpeter swans to hooded and red-breasted mergansers. In a late spring, if the ice has lingered into mid-March, the numbers of mergansers, common goldeneye, and lesser and greater scaup can be breathtaking, while an earlier breakup may see large flocks of redheads, blue-winged teal, and ruddy ducks arriving. All those tasty waterfowl make Carter Lake irresistible to bald eagles. On a typical March visit, anywhere from 7 or 8 to dozens of eagles lurk along the lakeshore here, dozing in the trees or on the ice, waiting for some hapless duck or goose to get sloppy. Occasionally, these sleepy scavengers hasten things along by actively chasing potential prey. Sometimes they succeed. One of the truly memorable moments in my birding life was here at Carter Lake on a March morning a few years ago when I watched a peregrine falcon take a belted kingfisher out of the air, only to be attacked in turn from above by a bald eagle. Normally, it would have been no contest, but the peregrine was weighed down by its ambitious catch, and the eagle hit the falcon hard, causing it to drop the struggling kingfisher into the shallows, where the eagle landed on it to enjoy a nice mid-morning snack. Another Missouri River cutoff, Lake Manawa, is even more spectacular than Carter Lake. Eagles are common here too, drawn by the same abundance of bird life that attracts us. It depends on the year, but the waterfowl tally on our March visits often runs into the many thousands of ducks, with hundreds of canvasback, redheads, and mergansers rafting on the deep water, while tens of thousands of snow, rosses, cackling, and greater white-fronted geese pass over, following the river north. It must have been like this in Audubon's day. And in fact, Audubon and his party set up camp about a mile west of Lake Manawa on their 1843 visit to the plains. Manawa is also where we make our first try at American woodcock in the evening. This and many other eastern birds follow the Missouri River up into eastern Nebraska, where the surviving tracts of Carolinian forest harbor species impossible to find anywhere else in the state. The 1,600 acres of oak, linden, and hickory in Fontenelle Forest, which we visit variously at the beginning or at the end of our tour, are home to red-bellied and pileated woodpeckers, Carolina and winter wrens, tufted titmice, rusty blackbirds, sometimes wintering red-headed woodpeckers, and even the occasional red-shouldered hawk. Species like that are a particular treat for those of us who hail from farther west, but even for tour participants from Eastern North America, our time in these forested habitats creates a piquant contrast with what is to come. We head west then. We usually find time to pause at a site or two preserving remnants of Nebraska's most urgently threatened habitat, saline wetlands. Lincoln, the state capital, was founded to exploit a huge salt basin discovered there in the 1850s. Today, only about 2,000 scattered acres of salt marsh remains, the last refuge of endangered endemics like the Salt Creek tiger beetle. For birds, these shallow wetlands come into their own a little later in the spring, but in March, we often run into eastern meadowlarks, harrises and American tree sparrows, and sometimes an early Franklin's gull or two. 90 interstate miles west is the Big Bend of the Platte River, a 60-mile stretch of shallow water, barren sandbars, and soggy floodplain lowlands. This Big Bend area is centered on Kearney, the state's fourth or fifth largest city, with about 35,000 inhabitants and a campus of the University of Nebraska. Kearney is also, if it does say so itself, the Sandhill Crane capital of the world. Every spring, the Big Bend and the associated wetlands host something like 20 million ducks and geese of more than 24 species. The earliest arrivers among the waterfowl tend to be northern pintails, with more than half of the continent's population stopping off here in February and March. These long-necked, long-tailed, long-winged birds are famously dashing at any season, but the sight and sound of their whirring, whistling courting flights, 5 or 6 males eagerly escorting a single female, gives the observer an entirely new image of these hens and ducks. Early in the season, too, single flocks of snow geese regularly approach 1 million birds, turning vast expanses of farmland and pasture white, well after the last of the winter snowfall is expected. Along with them come tens of thousands of Ross's geese. And there is no place better to compare these stout, stubby little birds with their larger, leaner relatives. You may notice that we're often fortunate enough to get rather close to some of these birds. There are Canada geese too, of course, but in any given year, this familiar species is noticeably outnumbered by Richardson's cackling geese, once again recognized as distinct at the species level from the larger, lankier Canada. Like the Ross's goose, cacklers like this one are significantly, abruptly less common at most sites east and west of here, making this a prime opportunity to get to know this endearing little goose and the sometimes subtle characters we can use to distinguish it from its more familiar cousin. The entire mid-continent population of another abundant goose species, the greater white-fronted, passes through central Nebraska each spring too, but its schedule is less regular. In some years, the bulk of the population has already moved north by mid-March, while in others, like 2023, good numbers lingered late into the month. To my mind, there is still nothing more evocative of the prairie spring than the sweet-voiced tootling laughter of a flock of white fronts drifting down from the sky. All of this abundance sets the stage for the real stars of the show, the vast flocks of sandhill cranes that stage every March on the Platte. This is the most spectacular migratory concentration of cranes in the world. The first birds arrive on the Platte around the 1st of February, scattered dozens and hundreds, and numbers slowly build for the next 5 weeks or so. Then suddenly, in the 3rd week of March, these early arrivals are joined in an abrupt rush by the rest of the high latitude breeding cranes. And all at once, those 60 miles of river between Chapman and Overton become the nighttime roost of more than 600,000 sandhill cranes. They leave the roost each morning and they return each evening in an unforgettably raucous tumult of long legs and necks and deafening shouted rattles. In the course of our tour, we typically pay 5 or 6 visits to different viewing sites along the river, in the morning and in the evening. And each outing is different. The light, the weather, the birds' attitudes and behaviors are ever changing. The only constant is that every time, this experience is overwhelmingly beautiful and beautifully overwhelming. Ben, would you please play some Sandhill Crane sounds for us? This is an evening view from the Fort Kenny Bridge. Thank you, Ben. The cranes. They include a couple of weeks later the entire surviving wild population of whooping cranes. But all of them, the Sandhill cranes and the whooping cranes, plus the rare common crane, the rare hooded crane, are here because of the nature of the Platte River. The river here is a sprawling network of braided channels, the largest of which are wide enough to provide clear sightlines for the nervous birds at roost. Some of the channels are deep enough to deter mammalian predators like coyotes and bobcats. Most important, though, the channels that the cranes use year after year are straight enough that the springtime rush of snowmelt from the Rockies, coming down the North Platte and the South Platte, scours the riverbed clean, preventing the establishment of cottonwood and willow forests on the big sandbars, forests that would make that stretch of river useless to the cranes. The Platte River nearly lost its unique character, and with it nearly lost its cranes 45 years ago when a dam and a reservoir were planned on Wyoming's Laramie River, an important tributary of the North Platte. The state of Nebraska, the National Audubon Society, and the National Wildlife Federation sued under what was then the relatively new Endangered Species Act to stop this project. Gray Rocks Reservoir in Wyoming was eventually built. But the legal settlement that permitted that included the creation of the Platte River Whooping Crane Maintenance Trust. That fund, almost half a century later, is still being used to acquire and preserve habitat in the Central Platte Valley. The money pays for the restoration of prairie wetlands, and the money pays for heavy equipment and heavy equipment operators to replace the scouring power of the now diminished spring flows, removing that sandbar vegetation that would block the roosting crane's view of potential predators. As the name of the trust reveals, that original lawsuit was filed on behalf of the whooping crane, whose population in the 1970s was still struggling to exceed 100 individuals. Historically, whooping cranes like this one arrived on the Platte in the second week of April or so, well after the peak of Sandhill crane migration. But over the past 20 years, as the population of whooping cranes has increased and the odd individual has wintered north of the usual Texas coast site, a few whooping cranes have been appearing in the great March flocks of Sandhill cranes in Nebraska. And we've come to expect one or two, or sometimes even three on our March tour. The plight of the big white crane was apparent to everyone as early as the turn of the 20th century, but bizarrely, the Sandhill crane phenomenon on the Platte was still hardly known to birders or ornithologists or land managers as late as the 1960s. Several things changed that. The move, encouraged by the early successes of the Crane Trust, the move away from a focus on the conservation of organisms to a focus on the conservation of habitat. The completion of Interstate 80 across Nebraska brought more people into the Central Platte Valley. And the arrival at the University of Nebraska of the late Paul Johnsgard, whose writings helped demonstrate just how remarkable this March phenomenon on the river really is, made all the difference. Nowadays, Kearney, right in the middle of the Big Bend area, and our base for most of the March tour, Kearney sees more crane watching visitors than it has residents. The number of ornithotourists each March hovers between 45 and 50,000. And after an early period of bemusement, central Nebraska businesses and governments and farmers have come to see in us not just a bunch of kooky birdwatchers, but a significant economic force. Birders spend something like $14 million every spring in central Nebraska. Most of the birds that bring us and our dollars here each March are the so-called lesser sandhill cranes. But there are also fair numbers of birds assignable to the greater subspecies. It's the lessers that make the longest journey. They breed from Nunavut into the Russian Far East and Siberia. Greater sandhill cranes nest farther east and farther south. The difference between the two is sometimes appreciable in the field. Graders are, unsurprisingly, large and light-colored, with pale gray rather than blackish gray primaries. Lesser sandhill cranes, in spite of their name, are still big birds. They stand 3 to 4 feet tall, and their wingspan extends to right around 6 feet. They weigh 8 to 12 pounds, and they're at their heaviest just before they take off for the north at the end of March, when they've spent 3 or 4 weeks fattening on waste grain, tender early sprouts, invertebrates, and the early snake or lizard that they might find on floodplain fields and meadows. One of the eternal fascinations about cranes is their social behavior, not just in their flocks, but also in their family unions. Sandhill cranes breed at 2 or 3 years of age, laying 2 eggs. Those young usually stay with their parents well into the first spring, and the family unit is often detectable within even the most massive flock. In flight, the yearling cranes are easily identified by their slightly ludicrous, high-pitched buzzing call, very unlike the trumpeting rattle of the parents. On the ground, the young cranes practice their dancing, bowing and leaping in imitation of the courtship of the adults, sometimes picking up a dirt clod or a cornstalk to toss into the air. Cranes dance throughout their lives, and it's great entertainment in spring to try to figure out which moves are aggression, which moves are play, and which moves are involved in pair formation and pair affirmation. The good news is that unlike most other crane species, sandhill crane numbers are increasing, thanks to the abundant corn left on the fields of central Nebraska, and until very recently, thanks to strong governmental incentives to conserve wetlands. Habitat loss and changes in agricultural practices remain threats, but for the moment, these birds of the gray wind seem secure. As endlessly captivating as the cranes are, whether they're on the roadside overhead or gathered to form immense feathered islands on the river, our tour also slips away from the river briefly to witness another of the springtime spectacles of the Great Plains, the booming of the Greater Prairie-Chicken. Beginning in early March every year, male chickens gather on level, lightly vegetated patches in the prairie to square off with one another and ultimately to win the hearts, however briefly, of the local prairie chicken females. This lekking behavior, where males display socially and females choose the winner, occurs in everything from tropical manakins to Arctic breeding shorebirds, but it's hard to beat the Greater Prairie-Chicken for sheer showmanship. Now, for those of us whose spines chill at the thought of early morning departures, there's good news too. Based for this part of our tour in the city of McCook in southwest Nebraska, we find ourselves right on the western boundary of the central time zone, meaning that sunrise is blessedly late. We usually leave our hotel at 6:30 in the morning, a shockingly humane time. And because the lek we visit is just a couple of miles out of town, it's a 20-minute ride before we're comfortably ensconced in the cushioned seats in our blind. Just as dawn breaks, we hear the humming and hooting of the first males. Ben, could you give us some prairie chicken sounds, please? I could watch that all day long. Just as the sun rises, The daylight reveals anywhere from a dozen to 20 or more greater prairie chickens in full display, some of them just a few yards away, even in easy cell phone camera range. This early in the season, there are usually no females present yet, but that doesn't seem to limit the male sense of urgency as they inflate those orange neck sacs, raise the long feathers behind their eyes, droop their wings, cock their square tails, and stamp their feet in the effort to intimidate all their competitors. When the spirit is truly upon them, they kick each other and strike each other with their wings. What may look more than vaguely comical to human eyes is deadly serious for these grouse. The top 1 or 2 males on each lek will wind up fathering 80% or more of the clutches produced that year, while the others will go home disappointed, all their dancing and all their squabbling for naught. Something like 85% of all the prairie chickens left in the world are found in Nebraska. And over much of their range in the western portions of the state, unlike their distribution in the eastern portion of Nebraska, their numbers have increased, largely, I think, as these grassland specialists have come to accept waste grain on irrigated cropland in the winter. There's some indication, however, recently that the population may be on the cusp of another decline as insect populations crash. Spilled corn is just no good for raising chicks, which require a steady diet of grasshoppers and other prairie invertebrates if they're to survive into the winter. Over the course of our tour, we'll encounter many more species, and we'll learn more about each of them, their characteristics and their circumstances. Most of all, though, the facts and the knowledge aside, we'll find ourselves moved again and again by the ancient rhythms of the land, the river, and the birds that depend on them. I hope you'll think about joining me in March as we visit Nebraska in spring.
That's fantastic, Rick. Thank you so much for that presentation. We'd like to turn to Barry Lyon, who was recently there this last March with Rick. Would you like to share some of your experiences, Barry?
Yeah, I would. Thank you, Ben. And thank you, Rick, for a tremendous presentation. You know, I wasn't going to be a part of this webinar necessarily, but I chose to join because when I got to thinking about Rick's presentation, the memories that I had from a trip that I did with Rick in March are still so fresh. I just wanted to sort of convey on a bit of that feeling on top of the presentation that we just witnessed here. And, you know, early in my career, I was fortunate to co-lead this trip with another of our leaders, but that's been so long ago that frankly, I had forgotten what this experience is like. And to be in Nebraska in March and to experience not just a great spectacle, but really what is one of the wonders of the world. I just feel that way. The prairie chickens and the Sandhill cranes and all the other birds, the waterfowl, the birds of prey, just sort of on and on. It's just so special. It's really difficult to describe it. But also to be there with Rick, who just knows the country so well, the land, the history, the people, in addition to the birds. It's just a singular experience. And, you know, I don't want to go overboard with it, but I really feel for people who love birds and who love nature. This is a must thing to do. And, you know, we offer this trip most years. We're so glad that it's on the schedule for next year and again in 2025. And again, it is just truly a must-see experience.
Thanks for those good words, Barry. It really was a very special trip this March of 2023. No one yet has asked about the weather, so I will volunteer the information. This is the end of winter on the Great Plains. And Great Plains weather at any season is extraordinarily variable. That's the case in March too, but as the first days of spring approach, the temperature rises. We have never on this trip experienced temperatures anywhere near zero. And most days we find ourselves getting down to the high 20s, low 30s at night, and then up into the 50s, perhaps even the 60s during the day. Our record high temperature on this trip was several years ago, 84 degrees one afternoon after we've been watching prairie chickens. Don't count on that, but do count on a wide range of temperatures. Snow and ice, it's very late for snow by the end of March. I believe that in one of the years that I've conducted this tour, which has been quite many years, in one of those years we had measurable snow. Otherwise, we occasionally have had a little bit of a sprinkle on one day or the other. But for the most part, I count on these days, the end of March, being pleasantly cool, not quite warm yet, but not cold either, and in general dry. So the weather here is quite good. In our prairie chicken blind, which is on private land, leased by the city of McCook, Nebraska, to make the prairie chicken lek accessible, there is always hot coffee available, and the chairs in the blind are padded. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. So that keeps you warm, and the fact that there are also blankets available if you need them also keeps you warm. We're in there just at dawn, and so it is the coldest part of the day, but no one suffers.
I would just want to echo what Barry said. It's one of the must trips. I've been on 3 times. I'd love to do it again. One of the greatest trips of my life. Don't miss it. Take this trip and you will love it.
All right, thank you, Victor. And thank you, Rick. It looks like
Absolutely.
That concludes today's presentation, and we thank everybody for joining us today. And we hope you'll consider signing up with Rick Wright on one of his future Nebraska cranes and grouse tours.